Thank you for inviting me to talk on this subject, Inia and Christiana. But firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the work of a colleague, Alison Rabinovich, who in her master's thesis of 2010, A History of Horn Strings, Organology and Early Sound Recording, 1899 to 1945, wrote the most extensive history of the Stroh violin and its variants to date, especially in the Australian context. I collaborated with Alison on her research, and we also researched the auxetophone instruments of Charles Parsons and Horace Short together, and Alison also contributed to material to a couple of exhibitions that I mounted featuring my own fairly large collection of Stroh horned instruments, as you can see in the vitrine there. Yes, they're all my instruments. The exhibition was at the Musical Museum at the Royal College of Music in 2013. I'm going to discuss the often disregarded role of the Stroh violin in the acoustic recording studio. I will also, but I'm not going to talk about a lot of horn-stringed variants and rival instruments, with the exception of the auxetophone instruments of Short and Parsons. And then I will attempt to show that the Stroh violin has managed to defy obsolescence. But given the theme of this conference, I'll focus more on the Stroh violin as a recording instrument, especially in its earliest years. Now, the Stroh violin was, in fact, the product of experimental science into acoustics that followed Thomas Edison's first reproduction of recorded sound in 1877. The violin's inventor, Augustus Stroh, was a distinguished telegraph engineer, a former associate of Charles Wheatstone, and considered to be one of the finest mechanical engineers in Britain. He built and demonstrated the very first phonograph outside of the USA in 1878, making significant improvements to its mechanism. Only a year later, in 1879, together with William Preece, who was later to become chief engineer of the post office and an early radio pioneer, Stroh, with Preece, conducted experiments in synthetically reproducing vowel sounds using his own especially constructed machines, including an automatic phonograph. They were attempting to demonstrate theories of Helmholtz. He also designed the very first commercial phonographs in Britain, produced and manufactured by the London Stereoscopic and Photographic Company between around 1885 and 1891. And notable too was his invention of a portable detective disc recorder, which is at the Science Museum. It is the most sophisticated sound recording apparatus of its time, and it deserves a whole talk on its own. But it was never patented. Moreover, his understanding of the sound amplifying potential of vibrating diaphragms, coupled with an interest in the mechanics of musical instruments, and this is shown in his previous work with Charles Wheatstone, gave rise to the most radical departure in string instrument design since the 1600s. The mechanically amplified violin, for which he was issued a patent in 1899. Now, a brief overview of the instrument. The violin playing parts, the maple neck, ebony fingerboard, as well as the pegs, tailpiece and bridge and strings are standard violin components. The metal parts are mostly made out of aluminium, which is a kind of high-tech material of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, comparable to carbon fiber today, I suppose. Also, in aluminium salts are a component of blank recording media, cylinders. Duncan reminded me today. Now, the wooden bridge sits on a rocking lever mechanism that transmits the vibrations of the bridge to a large aluminium diaphragm via a long screw. So the system is basically exactly the same as that of a gramophone sound box, and instead of a steel needle modulated by the groove on the record, it's the side-to-side movements of the bridge that rocks the lever, which in turn pushes and pulls the diaphragm in sympathy with the vibrations created by the agitated strings. Now, the underside of the diaphragm chamber leads to an opening to which is attached a large expanding aluminium horn. And the horn is able to swivel a full 360 degrees, not only allowing for the horn to be freely positioned while playing, but also for the compact storing of the violin in its case. So we can see that this is an instrument that is the direct result of the invention of the phonograph, and it uses exactly the same method of mechanical sound amplification. Now, the violin didn't achieve its final form for another 2 years until 1901, after Augustus Stroh's groundbreaking invention of an aluminium cone-shaped diaphragm with annular corrugations, used not only to amplify stringed instruments, but which was also to become the basis for the design of electrically powered loudspeaker cone systems, which continues to this day. Now, it's commonly stated in books and articles on the history of recorded sound that the Stroh violin was invented for acoustic recording, and this is not true. Augustus Stroh saw his invention as a new type of violin, an improvement, in fact, to the centuries-old traditional stringed instrument design, using the newly developed system of mechanically amplified sound. Now, its pedigree as a scientifically developed instrument is confirmed by John Ambrose Fleming's demonstration of the Stroh violin at one of his legendary Christmas lectures at the Royal Institution in 1901. Fleming praised the instrument as one in which scientific construction predominates over individual art or tradition in manufacture, meaning it could be mass-produced. Yet, at the same time, the musical effects which skill in playing can produce are not at all diminished. And press review of the instrument also praised its ability to instantly produce a full tone without the years of playing in that a normal wooden violin requires, while making a violinist believe him to be a far better player than he really is. Now, the first public performance was given in November 1901 with excerpts from Wieniawski and Mendelssohn. A year later, further bold claims were made in the press as to the loudness and quality of sound it produced, and even its superiority over the Cremonese masters. A quote from this article in the Strand was, "Much has been written about what is termed the reverse force of a Joseph Guarnerius. As a matter of fact, a Stroh has the reserve power of 3 Josephs and is as loud as 4 ordinary violins." That was written by D. Donovan in the Stroh Violin, the Strand magazine, in 1902. Now, just to temper the hype a bit, Donovan was the pen name of Augustus Stroh's business manager, Preston Muddock. Basically, after it was basically failed to launch as a bona fide concert instrument. Interesting, and it began to be used in the early recording studios. Now, there is a strong link here because Augustus Stroh passed over the manufacture and design of the Stroh violin to his son Charles Stroh, who later was to become a director of the Sterling Record Company. And Sterling took over the production of the Stroh violin, and so it's no accident that they started to be used in the early studios. Now, conventional stringed instruments they fare very badly in the acoustic recording process because the open sound of a stringed instrument is not successfully captured by the recording horn unless it's positioned extremely closely, as you see in this slide of Charles Dalmain. The Stroh violin, however, is ideal for this purpose, as its horn swivels on its drum casing, and it allows it for it to be aimed directly at the recording horn. And space being at a premium, entire string sections were reduced to just 2 or 3 Stroh violins and a Stroh viola. A bassoon would substitute the cello, and a tuba in place of a double bass. As you can see in these drawings that were published after the end of the acoustic era, the one with Rosario Burden is a famous photograph. Again, it was actually taken this, it was more of a portrait to document the acoustic process. It was taken in about 1925, and it was accompanied by a photograph of an early electrical setup for recording. Unfortunately, I don't have that picture. Now, also we have evidence in correspondence in the EMI archives from the Victor Talking Machine, that the Victor Talking Machine company replaced, well, all of the companies, G&T and Deutsche Grammophon, they replaced conventional violins and violas with Stroh instruments in around 1905. It was actually company policy. There was a correspondence between C.G. Child, head of artists department of Victor, and Theodore Birnbaum, managing director of the Gramophone Company, in 1905, stating that from now on we will only use Stroh violins in place of conventional ones. And thanks to George Brook-Nanestad for finding that piece of correspondence. Now, Charles Dalmain, and this picture here shows a multi-horn setup. You can see that the violins are represented as horns. The two violins and violas are represented as horns in this studio setup. I'm going to play, one of the earliest recordings of the Stroh violin by Charles Dalmain. He was the leader of the Edison Orchestra, and he was actually one of the first known violinists to make recordings of any kind, as early as 1899, and he was also the house violinist, or as they were called, the house violinist of the Victor Company from about 1900. And it's the records that he made for Victor that have endowed us with the first known recordings of the Stroh violin in 1904. The Victor catalogue of a year later in 1905 lists a special series called Viol Horn Solos, popular tunes, and it states in the catalogue that the viol horn is an entirely new instrument. Now, I'm going to be playing this piece later with Inya, the Serenade by Pian, but here's a short extract with Charles Dalmain playing. I'm going to cut this short as I know I'm running out of time here. So now, excellent player though he was, Charles Dalmain is not considered as being a leading violin soloist of his time, but many who did record with the Stroh violin, including Carl Flesch, pictured here, Marie Soldat-Röger, and Jan Kubelik. And Flesch wrote in his memoirs, as early as 1905, I had played for Odeon Records in Amsterdam some pieces on the Stroh violin, a cross between a silent violin and a trumpet, which was then considered the most efficient means of recording. I'll quickly just play this. An extract from Tartini Sonata. Now, while Jan Kubelik is a bit more problematic because there were announcements in 1904, which neither myself or Alison have not been able to find, stating that Kubelik has made 2 records with his own Stradivarius, not a Stroh. But I would argue that a lot of his early recordings were made with a Stroh instrument, especially if you listen to this Paganini Caprice, which features a lot of left-hand pizzicato, which I think would be extremely difficult to record acoustically on a conventional violin. Now, one can assume that most recordings made before 1925, before change over to electrical recording in the mid-1920s anyway, featured stringed instruments are likely to have used Stroh violins, and they are present in many recording studio portraits of the period showing string sections. Now, the recording industry and the studios, we know, were notoriously secretive about their recording methods, often hiding from view their multiple recording horn setups and almost never disclosing their recording equipment. It may have been the case that the extent of the use of Stroh instruments was kept a secret from music critics and the public in order to foster the illusion of natural instruments emanating from records and not mechanically assisted ones. The photographs that we do have were all released or published after the acoustic era. Here, this picture, I just wanted to show this because there's a probable, actually identified the recording that they might have been, the piece they might have been recording, but I haven't got time to play that now. But I'll move on. I mean, even during the later part of the acoustic era, when there was a demand and a desire for phonographic realism, using full orchestral forces and large string sections, these would be reinforced by the addition of 2 or more Stroh violins. And there's plenty of, again, photographic evidence for this between 1910 and 1925. Here's a picture of the Alfred Hertz and the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra from 1913. The picture shows a 52-piece orchestra with 16 violins and violas, 2 cellos that are seen there, and 3 double basses. But if you look in the back row, lo and behold, there's a Stroh horn peeking through there. So, although this was advertised as one of the first attempts at capturing the sound of a Wagnerian orchestra by this esteemed engineer Max Humper, they were actually being helped out a bit by the good old Stroh violin. And later, this was recorded in September of 1913. 2 months later, in November, the Berlin Philharmonic under Arthur Nikisch would capture the sound of a full classical orchestra. Again, presumably using Stroh instruments. Now, there is an excerpt of this, but I don't think I've got time to play that, actually. I think that before I just quickly mention about the about what happened later, Stroh, after the change to electrical recordings, the Strohs weren't used in the recording studios, or were hardly used. There are some instances, but basically after the studio came the dance hall. They became further integrated into the jazz and dance scene, and as novelty instruments. It was competing as a leader of the dance with saxophones and brass instruments and clarinets, and the horn was able to ape the sort of hot jazz movements that were popular at the times. It was also advertised as the cello, the new cello that emerged in around 1927, was advertised as a substitute for a tenor saxophone. Again, there was a Stroh double bass that was advertised as a substitute for a tuba. Many popular artists recorded with the Stroh as well. I mean, going back to the acoustic era, a blues violinist Stuff Smith, the famous tango composer and violinist Julia De Caro, and James Scott Skinner, a very famous Scottish composer and violinist. They all recorded with the Stroh violin. Julio De Caro, interestingly, also continued to perform with his violin trompeta during the late 1920s and then into the 30s. Now, one most significant contemporary influence that at the time was the auxetophone instruments of Charles Parsons and Horace Short. Again, based on a redesign of a mechanical gramophone, the auxetophone gramophone that used compressed air, which brought the first successful means of reproducing recorded music in the open air, for instance, audiences of thousands. It was played in stadia and in parks, in bandstands. Now, there was a relationship with Henry Wood, the famous conductor. Wood attended a private session held by Charles Parsons, who was demonstrating his adaptation of stringed instruments with auxetophone amplification. And Henry Wood was inspired by this, and he encouraged Charles Parsons to continue his development and of these instruments. And Wood sought to reconfigure the British orchestra using single amplified stringed instruments in place of large sections, and having full contingents of wind and brass. These instruments were basically, Wood also introduced one of these instruments in 1906 into one of his promenade concerts. So instead of 8 double basses, there was a single double bass with this giant horn with the air compressor in the basement of the King's Hall, and with the management complaining about the large electricity bill. Now, these instruments had but I should say that the musicians were not pleased by this. They had the equivalent of electrical transducers or pickups, but that were driven by compressed air instead of electrical current. Rubber tubing and air valves were replaced by thermionic valves and copper cables. So these auxetophone instruments were the direct forerunners of amplified acoustic instruments that we know today, and are a transitional link between the mechanical, acoustic, and electrical systems of sound reproduction. But unfortunately, they didn't take off because of hostility from the musical fraternity. Auxeto instruments are not important in the history of recorded music, but like the Stroh violin, they were the product of highly successful experiments in mechanical sound reproduction during the late 19th and early 20th century. This was Charles Parsons' last attempt to promote the auxetophone cello with August van Biener, a famous popular cellist. Unfortunately, the concert didn't go down very well. There was a lot of distortion. Maybe we would have reportedly a lot of distortion, but anyway, there were reasons for that. Unfortunately, Horace Short had joined his brothers in working on aeroplanes at the time, so that's why, apparently. Now, legacy of the Stroh violin. They had an impact on the new electric violins from the 1930s, the Beauchamp electric violins, for instance, and now in 1998, the silent cello. I remember seeing this in Munich in the Pinakothek as an example of design excellence. It was actually exhibited, the Yamaha silent cello, but it is a complete rip-off of a Stroh cello. All the parts, the folding parts and everything. It suddenly, curiously, this is my way into the Stroh violin, was through finding one of these folk instruments. There's an intriguing story about how they made it to Transylvania, possibly from Germany. And they're still being made and played today in a particular region of Transylvania, and even they have issued a special postage stamp with a picture of the Viowara Kugawara. They're made also in Burma, in Myanmar, former British colony. They were advertised as being suitable for the tropics. They didn't suffer like conventional violins. So anyway, but they're still made and played, and they are exported as well. They've become very popular amongst pop musicians and pop fiddlers. Tom Waits' band, the violinist of Tom Waits' band, plays one of these Burmese Strohs. Also in Finland, Olavi Linden, who's an engineer, has remade the violin using carbon fiber materials, very, very successfully, I might add. And these are some of my own projects. I'd just like to very quickly close with some comments. I'm sorry, I've gone over time. The Stroh violins were arguably used in the vast majority of recordings made in the acoustic era that featured stringed instruments in orchestral, dance and entertainment musics. Any study of recordings of the acoustic era that feature violin or viola should take this into account and reflect on how the use of these instruments may have affected performance, effect on individual playing styles, etc. And it's also, I'm making a plea for the development of methods of analysis through digital software and informed listening to determine or verify these instruments on acoustic recordings. And those early examples I played, the solo, it's possible to determine the particular timbre of the instrument. Now, although they were being manufactured in the early 1940s, because of the emergence of electrical amplification in the microphone, they did have an influence on solid body stringed instruments and also pickups, in the case of the auxetophone. Now, Stroh violin instruments were made and manufactured for about 40 years, which is a very respectable life for an instrument, I think, especially in the 20th century, which saw a flourish of new instruments. For instance, the pianola was manufactured for a little more than 30 years. So the Stroh violin does deserve serious consideration as an important musical instrument, in my view. And there has been a resurgence in recent years. Originals are much sought after. Copies are sold online, and many musicians continue to play and record with them. So contrary to popular belief, they have not died out, but have managed to defy obsolescence. Thank you very much. Sorry.